This short explainer video reviews what the reserves are and describes 3 different hypothetical funding scenarios proposed by the finance team for discussion. Reserves are like a savings account for a neighborhood. The funds cover repairs, replacements, and unexpected costs. Here's a glimpse of SoCo's latest reserve study. As you can see, there are multiple components, and each component has its own timeline for repair and replacement. Not everything will need to be replaced at the exact same time. If every single component on the reserve study were to need replacement at the exact same time, you would want to be 100% funded in order to pay for all of it at once. This means the reserve account balance equals the estimated accumulated depreciation of the community's property. In layman's terms, think of it as having the value of each year's wear and tear and all community property set aside in reserves. Here are a few examples. Up at the top, you'll notice a timeline all the way out to 50 years. On the side, we have components and the number of years they're predicted to last. If we have speakers that we want to replace in 5 years, and the total cost will be $100 in 5 years, we'll need to put aside $20 every year for 5 years. If we have a treadmill that we want to replace in 10 years, with the total cost being $400 at 10 years, we'll need to put away $40 every year for 10 years. Replacing solar in 30 years for a total cost of $60,000, we'll need to put away $2,000 every year for 30 years to meet our goal. And if we're going to replace the parking lots in 45 years, we'll need to put away $2,111.11 every year for 45 years for a total of $95,000. You don't pay for everything all at once. Instead, the community saves a little bit each year so it's ready when the time comes. You would only absolutely need to be fully funded if every item in the reserve study was due to be replaced in the same year. This is why funding the reserves at 100% is not practical or necessary. 70% funded is widely considered to be a strongly funded reserves. 70% funded would mean we have 70% of the value of the wear and tear on all community property, which would be 70% of the replacement cost of something at the end of its useful life. But since we also have 70% of all the accumulated wear and tear on everything else, including things which don't need to be replaced for decades, there's still always more than enough to pay for everything if we're at 70% funded. When we talk about contributions to reserves and our HOA dues, we're not just stashing money away. We're covering the real cost of wear and tear on community property, which would normally be called depreciation expense in standard accounting. This is what it truly costs to keep Sonora Co-housing running over time. While we can question some of the assumptions in the reserve study or tighten a few budgets, the idea that our dues are artificially high because of reserves is a misunderstanding. In fact, the difference between doing nothing and aiming for fully funded reserves over 30 years only changes dues by about 4 to 5%. When we don't have enough funds to pay for an item or a component we need to replace, that's when we do a special assessment. The finance team selected 3 reserves funding scenarios to present to the community to gauge community interest. Each scenario represents a different funding plan. The scenarios look at the next 30 years. However, choosing a plan does not lock the community into any particular direction for the next 30 years. Rather, it will represent an intention or philosophy regarding how to fund replacement of community property going forward. The 3 scenarios are building up the reserves, planned assessments, and fluctuating dues. Each scenario has its own pros and cons. Scenario number 1 is called building up the reserves. In this approach, dues increase gradually over 30 years towards a goal of 70% funded reserves by the end of 2055. Reserve study and financial position are reviewed regularly to ensure that we're on target. In this scenario, assessments are avoided. There's more investment income than in scenarios 2 and 3. We're better prepared for worst-case scenarios. The increase to HOA dues to fund the buildup of reserves are gradual, and most of the surplus is raised later in the 30-year plan, so current residents are still impacted minimally. And it keeps the community attractive to buyers. Lenders and buyers often see 70% funding as a reasonable, responsible level. Some of the cons include that there are higher overall costs to individual community members than scenarios 2 and 3, which means less money in our pockets. There are more funds tied up in reserves accounts that are managed by community members, and there is lack of consensus as how to best manage those accounts over a long period of time. Community members may lack the financial skills needed to adjust changing economic conditions over time. A return on investments may not keep up with inflation. There's no guarantee that funds will be used for the purpose they were reserved for. Scenario number 2 is called the planned assessment scenario. In this approach, HOA dues are about $20 a month less than the current level, and they only increase with inflation. There's no effort to build up reserves, and we are at 35% funded at the end of 30 years. The community would be reminded of planned assessments at least 5 years in advance. All replacement of community property estimated at over $15,000 in 2025 dollars are subject to a 50% assessment. This table that I'm going to show you next shows what the assessment schedule would look like and the cost per household. Here in this chart, you can get an idea of components that might need to be replaced in the future and the assessments households can expect. Some of the pros to the planned assessments model include lower monthly HOA dues. Residents retain more financial control of their money and can choose to invest their funds as they believe prudent instead of having the investment team make more conservative investment decisions, possibly losing value. Could be more flexible, allowing the community to decide how to fund each major project, and assessments at just 50% prevent them from being too burdensome. Some of the cons include that the Finance Committee is burdened with managing assessments and doing extra collections. The community members may struggle to pay their share of a $1,000 or more assessment. Assessments can discourage future buyers who may see financial uncertainty as a risk, and there's less flexibility if something breaks down sooner than its expected lifespan if the finance team hasn't been able to give 5 years notice to homeowners. It's less equitable as people who live in the community when assessments hit wind up paying for the wear and tear from residents in other years. And scenario number 3 is called the fluctuating dues model. In this approach, the concept of 100% funded reserves is defined only to include property that's in the last 10 years of its useful life. HOA dues are adjusted up and down from year to year to keep us fully funded per this alternate definition. Instead of keeping a high reserves balance at all times, reserve funds ebb and flow with higher collections in years leading up to a major replacement or repair. Assessments should not be necessary under this plan, but the lower reserves means that one could still be needed if a completely unexpected large expense arises. The 10-year horizon may be adjusted if more time is needed to prepare for large funding items. Some of the pros of this scenario include lower HOA dues than scenario 1. It avoids the assessments in scenario 2. It protects against losing buying power of our reserves over time by our investments not being able to keep up with inflation. Shorter time span for projecting into the future acknowledges that physical needs of the community are likely to change over the long term while still saving for known replacement needs, and residents retain more control of their money and can choose to invest as they believe prudent instead of having the investment team make more conservative investment decisions, possibly losing value. The cons include that it can lead to sharp HOA increases before major projects, which may feel like a financial strain. There's less predictability than more highly funded reserves plans, making long-term planning harder, and it's less equitable as people who live in the community when dues are higher in the years leading up to a project are effectively paying for the wear and tear from residents in other years. Next up, you will see a series of charts and graphs where you can compare the 3 different scenarios. Feel free to pause the video at any time to look more in depth at each chart or graph. Test, please record this. You don't pay for everything all at once. Instead, the community saves a little bit each year so it's ready when the time comes. You would only absolutely need to be fully funded if every item in the reserve study was due to be replaced in the same year. This is why funding the reserves at 100% is not practical or necessary. 70% funded is widely considered to be a strongly funded reserves.